In this Copilot Unplugged video, I want to talk about using Copilot to generate DAX queries in Power BI for Power BI semantic models. And I want to focus on how this experience, Copilot to generate DAX queries, is different from when you are using other generative AI tools, like, for example, Gemini or Chat-GPT or Claude, in order to generate your DAX code. So what are the main differences? Now, from what I understand, there are three major differences and three major reasons why the Copilot experience is going to be superior than what you have in these other tools. Now, reason number one is because Copilot is actually going to handle the model metadata, the context itself. So normally, if you want the best results from a generative AI tool, you have to provide sufficient context. Now, this context is not only coming from your prompt and your descriptions and your examples, but also from the actual model metadata that you should provide, like the BIM file or other metadata formats, in order to get the best results. Now, if you're using something like Chat-GPT or you're using Claude, you have to upload that BIM file and give it access to that information, which is not necessarily something you want to do because your model metadata could contain confidential and sensitive information. So if you're working in an organization and you want to use AI to help you generate DAX, this is definitely not something you should do using these publicly available tools. Now, if you're sufficiently technical and knowledgeable to be able to set up a local model running on your computer, then of course, you might be able to take steps to mitigate that, but most people can't do that or don't necessarily have the time and interest to do that. Now in Copilot, it takes that consideration off the table completely because it is just going to handle this context retrieval itself. So it is going to retrieve the relevant information from your model and provide it to the LLM so that it has the appropriate context to generate the DAX. You don't have to worry about handling files or providing that context. So reason number one, it's going to handle your model metadata. Now, reason number two is these generative AI tools are limited in terms of their training data. The training data dictates basically the responses that they're going to provide. So there's a lot of training data about DAX and DAX calculations and functions like, for example, calculate or sum or whatever, all this basic stuff. But let's say a new DAX function or a bunch of new DAX functions come out like next month, the next release of Power BI, it is going to not be in the training data for the generative AI model. That means that the likelihood of you getting useful outputs is much lower when you're asking for something that requires use of those functions than if you're asking for more simpler scenarios that require, other functions. Or even if these functions are now better than the other functions, it's more likely that you're going to get answers with those functions that are more prevalent in that training data. Now you can try to account for this yourself by explaining and providing context about these new functions and explaining how they work, or like copying and pasting information from documentation and so on. But then that's still relying on you to do that. Now, in Copilot, Microsoft is obviously aware of these limitations and they can take steps to mitigate or account for that, for example, in meta prompts by providing examples in those meta prompts. And Microsoft, of course, contains experts, people who are responsible for the DAX language, who created the DAX language, who are writing and providing those examples. So you can be sure that they are going to be the best examples and context that can be provided for that information, right? So reason number one is that Copilot is handling the metadata and the context. Reason number two is it's mitigating the effect of like the sparse training data and the more recent information that, could be an issue with other tools. And reason number three is actually, in my opinion, the strongest reason that Copilot takes the LLM response and it's going to post-process it by running it through a DAX parser. So if you get some bullshit back like calculate X, that's not going to pass that DAX parser check. It's going to fail, and then it will kick it back and ask for a better result. So you are more likely to get useful results, less likely to experience those hallucinations, particularly if it contains garbage and nonsense. And that is a huge benefit because you do not have that guarantee with other AI tools. If you get something back from Chat-GPT, it could contain a completely invented function or invented syntax that does not exist. And you don't know unless you have that pre-existing understanding of how that works and what's available in DAX. So you don't have to worry about that. There's a quality check that happens in that sort of post-processing step that is going to ensure that you get a functional DAX query. Now, does that mean that the query could not contain errors or unexpected results or blank, or it could time out and return an error as a result, or that there's an issue with your model that produces an error? Definitely not. Of course, all of that is entirely possible, potentially even likely, depending on your scenario, but it is definitely going to be less likely that you have these hallucinated outputs, these not very useful results, compared to other tools. So in summary, there are three major reasons why Copilot is potentially stronger and more useful than other AI tools when it comes to generating DAX queries. Number one, because it is going to handle the context, the metadata itself from the model. Number two, because Microsoft is going to try to account for things in the meta prompt, for example, more recent information, and they are responsible for this. And number three, the DAX parser during post-processing. Now, of course, there are also some caveats of Copilot in Power BI. For example, you don't know what model is being used. You can't change the configuration, these kind of things, because of course this is a Microsoft managed service. So there are just going to be things that you do not have visibility on and that you do not have control over. However, I think for the vast majority of scenarios, this isn't going to make a tremendous impact for most people, unless you're the kind of person who's already very, very deep into this stuff and you have a particular reason or preference to use one configuration or model over another. And in that case, you're maybe more likely to use something custom, like from, Azure OpenAI service, itself, for instance. Okay, so that's enough talking. I'll give some very, very brief demos, and then I'm going to eject for now, and then we'll pick up on this topic again another time, because there's a lot, honestly, that I could talk about. So I have Power BI Desktop open here, and we can use the DAX query view, which we have here, in order to generate DAX queries. So let's give a very simple example. So I have a model. I'm just going to think of a query of something to ask it. So generate a query to show the total order lines by customer key account, for instance. So you can see that we also have, in addition to the ability of writing our own prompt here, let's see if I can zoom. Yeah, so we can write a prompt here, but then I can also push these buttons in order to have, a suggestion or explain a DAX topic and so on. So I'm just going to click this now, and it's going to generate this. So I'm going to zoom back out. I don't want to exit Copilot. So it's now generating the query. It's taking some time. And it's very zoomed in for some reason. So at the top, what we have here is that it is going to contain the prompt at the very top, which is useful for traceability purposes, that it will contain the latest prompt. So if you're having a natural language conversation with Copilot and multiple prompts back and forth, it is going to only contain the latest one. So that's important to know. And then we see here that we have the query. For some reason, it's only taking up the top of the screen or whatever. So we have the evaluate, summarize columns, customer key in this case, and the total order lines. So here I asked it for the key account, customer key account, and then because I said customer key, that it took the customer key here. So this is something that I want to emphasize, is with some Copilot experiences like the DAX query view, for example, or sorry, like ask data questions, if you hide a column, like customer key is a key column and that should be hidden. So if you hide this column, then it is not going to be used by Copilot. But in the DAX query view, that is not true. So if you hide a column, it could still be picked up by Copilot. So in this case, I said customer key account, so it grabbed the customer key. So of course, this is not ideal. So let's try to fix that. And I might need to open a new window in order to say that. So let's go here, key account. And then let's run it again. And then let's see if it produces the expected result. But of course, because Copilot is going to take the chat history and the current DAX query as context, that means that it could potentially produce, a suboptimal result. So here we get the key account name, so we get the expected result. So it gives us the option whether we want to keep the query or discard it, but we can run it, and then we can see the results down here below. All right. So fine. We can ask it now to explain the query, for example. So, and then it should give us an explanation down here below under this window. So that was just a button that we pushed. and then we can expand it and it gives an explanation depending on, what's going on. This is a very simple query, so it's fine. So, and we can even ask it to modify the query by saying, please add comments to each line of the query to explain what that line does. So it can help us document that query. There's someone at my door, and we're back. So I asked it to generate, to add comments to each line of the query. We can see here, however, that it's adding those comments inside of this drop-down part down below rather than modifying it in the query itself, which is not ideal. So, okay. So then let's go and open a new query window and let's do something else, because people often ask, okay, but I don't want to write DAX queries. I want to create DAX measures. Well, you can use the DAX query view in order to create measures. For example, we can say, create a measure that calculates the difference between the order ship date, the order, let's say request goods receipt date, and the order ship date in hours for express orders. Show this measure in a DAX query by key account name. All right. So we're asking it to define a measure and then to use that measure in a DAX query by key account. Now, this is not the optimal prompt, but I'll explain why in a moment. So we're just going to submit this now, and we're going to ask Copilot to create that DAX measure and then to use it in a simple query. And we'll see what we get back from Copilot after it returns the result. All right. So this is the result that we get back. So interestingly, I can't, here we go further up here. So it does define a measure, and that measure is then going to include, in this case, the date diff of the request goods receipt date and the ship date. And it's going to determine this using, a max in this case between these two. That's actually the first time I've seen it do that. So usually it does it by using an iterator instead. And then it filters to express order on invoice document type. And then we get a particular result back. So now I want to walk through this and I want to explain, why this is not an optimal result, what I expected, and how we can modify our prompt in order to get that better result. So the first thing is that the measure, so in this case, actually what I expected it to do was to do something like a sum x or an average x over the orders table, and to be able to then calculate the difference between these two date fields in that iterator line by line, because of course this isn't something that you can just aggregate. If you just take the max of two order lines, that's illogical. You have to calculate this at the fixed granularity of order line in order for it to return a useful result. However, of course, we didn't provide that information. We just told it, calculate the time difference in hours, let's say here, calculate the difference between the order request or receipt date and order, ship date. So it's just doing what we told it in this case. Also, we asked for express orders, and it used the invoice document type in order to determine that, but it should have used the order document type. Now, of course, that's also logical. We said for express orders, but we didn't tell Copilot the context of how it should know what an express order is. So if we wanted to get a better result, we could instead say, create a query that has a measure calculating the average difference between order and order ship date, let's say request goods receipt date, and order ship date for orders with an order document type text of express order, and show this result by key account name. So in this case, we're asking it the measure calculate the average difference between an order request goods receipt date and order ship date for orders with an order document type text of express order. So in this particular prompt, we're trying to be a lot more literal, a lot more specific about what we want, what we expect, and how that result should appear. So it's not that different from the previous prompt that we used, but we're just trying to be more explicit in the result that we're trying to get, okay? So we'll send this now, and we'll see if we get closer to the desired output, the desired result that we want back. Okay, so here indeed, so it's doing the average. So let's try to format this, unfortunate. So it's doing the average X orders date diff between the ship date and the request goods receipt date. So we didn't tell it to do it by hour, but that's easy to modify ourselves. It calculated it in days, and then it does the filter on the appropriate field, and it does the summarize columns by key account name. Let's run the query, see what we get. We should have this in the opposite order. So it put ship date first, request goods receipt dates, and then we can run it again and see we get more or less an expected result here. So express orders should be shipped out in less than 24 hours. More or less, we can see that that number is hovering around there, but we would need to validate that farther, probably looking at a few different orders at the level of like the actual order lines to be able to say for sure. Now, we could then use this measure in a new measure in our model and then start using it in our reports. It's just important to understand, of course, that Copilot doesn't know how we're going to use that measure. It doesn't know that context or our intent of what we're going to use it for. So it could potentially return unexpected results depending on different contexts. So depending on, what we want to do, for example, like if we expected this to really return this average difference for express orders, like right now it's applying this filter at the level of the query, but we might have to modify this to, for example, like apply that filter in the measure to modify the filter context programmatically, for instance, with calculate or doing the filter, inside of the columns here, whatever, approach we choose to take in this particular instance. So that's just a brief demonstration of using Copilot in order to generate DAX queries and using it in various ways to, for example, create measures, create queries, and so on and so forth. And also, again, talking on the main differences between it and other generative AI tools that you can use to generate code.